Who owns ancient artefacts? The Greek government has fought for years to get back its Parthenon marbles from the UK. Many countries have also asked for objects stolen or pillaged to be returned. But where do these artefacts belong, and why do countries want them back? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hazem, Sika. It's been 200 years since the Greek Parthenon marbles were taken from Athens by a Scottish lord and sold to the British government. The sculptures now sit in the British Museum, and they become a source of national injustice for many Greeks who say they were removed illegally and should be returned. But should nations have the right to reclaim cultural property that may have been wrongly taken in the past? We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, Al Jazeera's John Saropoulos sets up our debate from Athens.
The new Acropolis Museum was built to reunite the Parthenon sculptures, those Elgin removed and those he left behind. Today, many visitors agree with that goal.
It's a beautiful gallery, but of course it would have been much more beautiful if the Elgin marbles would be there. And I had hoped, to be honest, that for this anniversary they would have come back here home.
I believe that about many of the things that, not just part of the Acropolis, but many of the ruins that the British have stolen from all over the world. But as we're standing here in Athens, I definitely believe that those things ought to be returned to this country.
Greece became an independent country 15 years after the British Parliament bought the marbles. In the 1980s, it launched a campaign to bring them home, a national goal with which almost all Greeks passionately agree. They argue that the marbles were violently and illegally removed. To remove the friezes, Elgin's men had to demolish parts of the Parthenon. The sculpted slabs are half a metre deep. To lighten the load in shipping, Elgin had the backs sawn off. This one broke in half. The brighter plaster cast represents the half now in the British Museum.
The House of Commons formed a committee to investigate how Elgin obtained the marbles, and it is on the basis of that committee's report that it decided to purchase them from him. But the committee had no independent documentary evidence. It only had Elgin's word to go on.
Elgin claimed he had obtained a firman, or decree, from the Ottoman Empire, which then included Greece. Recent research has unearthed why Elgin didn't make copies of the permissions he had.
Now, this is not a firman. It was a letter, a friendly letter, which was given under the table, really, to Lord Elgin. Now, what I have found as a researcher is that this document did not pass through the protocol of the embassy, as others did at the time. So this gives us the evidence that it was not officially done.
As British ambassador to Constantinople, Elgin apparently used his influence to study the Parthenon, then stretched that permission. Greece says that ownership is no longer the point. It just wants the sculptures reunited. John Saropoulos, Al Jazeera, Athens.
Well, there are thousands of artefacts around the world that have been stolen, sold or traded through dubious means, and some countries want them back. Some of the most controversial pieces are Egyptian. They include the Rosetta Stone discovered by a Frenchman and later acquired by the British, as well as the bust of Queen Nefertiti discovered by a German archaeologist, which now sits in a Berlin museum. The Egyptian government wants both pieces returned. Other disputed artefacts include the Indian Kohinoor diamond, one of the largest in the world. It was taken by Britain's East India Company and presented to Queen Victoria. Well, let's bring in our guests then. At the University of Oxford, we have Peter Stewart, Associate Professor of Classical Art and Archaeology. In The Hague, we have Nadia Banteka, Lecturer in International Law at the Hague University. Good to have you with us. Patrick Stewart, let me start then by asking why, when we look at artefacts like the Parthenon marbles or even any artefacts, why do they matter so much? Why are countries fighting over their ownership?
Well, they've come to matter in the modern world, in the 19th and 20th centuries, as symbols of national pride, as symbols of cultural heritage. And in a way, the whole concept of cultural heritage in that sense is something of a modern invention. But in the case of the Parthenon sculptures, which you started with, obviously, the controversy about these sculptures and the relevance to the modern Greek state goes right back to the dawn of modern Greece itself in the 1830s. And
in particular, the Parthenon marbles, what is their appeal both to historians and to lovers of this kind of work?
Well, their art historical appeal is a little bit different from the controversy we're discussing in a sense. I mean, these sculptures, which decorated the outside of the Parthenon, the most important temple in classical Athens, are extraordinary works of art from a technical point of view. First of all, they're extraordinarily ambitious. They are the level of craftsmanship is way beyond what we encounter in most other ancient temples. So people admire them for that reason. They also give us a very interesting insight into the mindset of the Athenians, the mindset of the Athenian city-state at the time this temple was constructed in the 440s and 430s BC. That's a time when Athens was at the height of its power. It was a democracy, but it was also essentially an empire. And in a way, the sculptures of the Parthenon give us an insight into the ancient ideology of democracy at that time and place, but also the attitude of the Athenians to their superiority over other Greek city-states, which they controlled in the aftermath of their victory over the Persian Empire.
Nadia, Banteka, as we said at the top there, it's been 200 years now since the Parthenon marbles were taken from Athens, and the Greek government is determined to get them back. Just talk us through the legal tools or options that Greece has at the moment to fight for their return. What kind of route can they take?
Well, let me start by a caveat, and the caveat is that the law on cultural property is quite a new legal regime. And by new, I mean that the first time that we see some sort of regulation in cultural property in international law is in 1899 and 1907 with the Hague regulations primarily governing the laws of war. After that, we had the Convention of Cultural Property in 1957. All these conventions are legal regimes that came after the expropriation of the Parthenon sculptures. This creates a fairly idiosyncratic statute of limitations for what type of legal routes are available. Now, if Greece were to contest legally in a court of law the ownership of these sculptures, the sort of primary method to go about it would be going to the International Court of Justice through an interstate dispute. Another means available would be to frame arguments in the form of human rights arguments through the European Court of Human Rights, and finally possibly through a domestic court dispute at a UK court. Now, which of those would be the best routes is a different question, but I would like you to keep in mind this particular idiosyncrasy regarding the law on cultural property.
And it sounds from what you're saying as well then that this is a fight that could take several years, couldn't it? It's particularly if there's a ruling that's just based on a technicality.
It would indeed take several years, but I believe the primary concern for both parties involved would be the precedential nature of a juridical outcome. In other words, if they go through a court of law, both parties in the dispute face the risk of having a legal document, a legal verdict, that ties them into a certain type of conduct which may not be to their liking. So legal routes in this case, due to the particular nature of the legal frameworks involved, could be somewhat tricky.
All right, at this point, we're going to bring in our third guest, Amr Al-Azm, who joins us from Portsmouth, Ohio. He is an associate professor of Middle East history and anthropology at Shawnee State University. Thanks for being with us. Before we get into the kind of rights and wrongs of all of this and where these artifacts really belong, just tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing in restoring many old treasures and artifacts, which I believe are from the Middle East.
Actually, I'm originally from Syria. I used to be the Director of Science and Conservation Laboratories at the Department of Antiquities in Damascus, right up to 2004. But my involvement right now with Syria and saving and preserving cultural heritage is obviously due to the conflict that is happening there. Currently, the Department of Antiquities obviously tries to do what it can in the areas under its control, under regime control, but there are most of the country is outside regime control. This is where you have non-state actors, you have local activists, local archaeologists, local museum curators who are all trying to rescue what they can. And I basically work with an organization, I'm one of the founders, who try to provide institutional support and try to provide funding, training, resources, etc., to help these people in places like the museum, for example, at Ma'abat al-Nu'man, which contains an extremely important and unique collection of mosaics, and yet the museum has been hit twice by regime airstrikes, most recent only a few weeks ago, causing serious damage. But because we've been able to sandbag the collections, we've been able to save them, and that's the kind of work that we do. And the organization is called The Day After, and the actual part that works with cultural heritage is the Heritage Protection Initiative.
And as much as the work that the groups like yourself have done in trying to locate many of these artifacts and restore them and so on, if you talk to many museum curators and people in museums in London and Paris and so on, they will say that it's reasons like this that these kind of artifacts should stay in those top museums in London and Paris, because that is where they can be taken care of. What do you say to that?
That is really a bogus argument, in my opinion. At the end of the day, you know, artifacts and cultural, by artifacts I mean here, cultural artifacts really only have their true potential value. They can only reach their true potential value when they are either preserved in situ, okay, that is on the monument or location where they come from, or within the culture and society and therefore country that they originate from, and the people that they connect to. Remember that for most people, they part of their national identity, part of their cultural identity is through their shared common history. And so when you take an object out of that context and you put it in a museum in a completely different place, in a different country, in a different society, culture, it has been cut off from its roots, from its origins, and it loses its true sense. It becomes just an inanimate thing that is just something to look at. Really, without the people that it represents, without the people that it's connected to, this object for me has little flavor or meaning. And it's the same for people. When people lose their cultural heritage, when people lose that connection with their past, with their history, then they also lose part of their national identity. So it really is very important to help keep these things where they originate from, because that's where their true value comes in. And some of the work that we do as well is to track and trace looted antiquities. You know, Syria is suffering a terrible war, and part of that war is being funded through looted antiquities. And the fight is also to try and stop the looting of antiquities inside Syria, and also to track and try to restrict people outside Syria buying these antiquities, and that would include major institutions and hopefully museums as well.
Well, let's get Peter's view on that then. I mean, these artifacts are symbols of the country's culture. They're part of their identity. Don't they belong in the country where they originated?
Well, first of all, I would say that there are not many curators or researchers who would argue that that antiquities, must stay in rich Western countries because that way they'll be safe. I don't think that's a major argument. Similarly, most curators and academics would be very much opposed to the illicit trade in antiquities, horrified by the tragedy going on in Syria and in other parts of the world. But I don't think it follows from that we can say that all antiquities must necessarily stay in the countries where they've been discovered, because otherwise an inherent bond with those cultures will be broken. I think the risk of thinking very rigidly in those terms is that we would lose all of the advantages of the so-called encyclopedic museums, the international museums that, as the British Museum always says, that present the world to the world. There aren't many people, I think, who would argue that we would be better off without the existence of the British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum, and so on. Now, that's not in any way to deny the controversies about particular antiquities or the concerns about looting and the trade. But particularly in today's globalized world, it's immensely important that artifacts from different cultures are presented to the greatest possible audience. And that might be partly through encyclopedic museums, but also through the internet and in other ways. We're a much more international audience for the remnants of the ancient world than was true in the past. And when you think of the millions of people who encounter some of these antiquities in collections like that in the British Museum, I think it would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we insisted that antiquities somehow inherently belong to the countries in which they were found. Now, there are all kinds of ways in which we can try and put them in context, and as an art historian, I believe very much in the importance of seeing artifacts in their context, in understanding why they were made, who made them, in how trying to understand how their world differs from the world we live in. All of that's really, really important, but there are different ways to achieve that, and it's partly through museums and curated archaeological sites in the countries of origin, but also through important international collections.
Nadia, Banteka, does it matter really where these artifacts end up? I mean, the argument that they belong to all of humanity, I mean, and if a museum like the British Museum can take care of them and maintain them, and people from all over the world are able to go there, then what's wrong with keeping them there?
Well, this is the typical debate that we see, particularly in international cultural property disputes between cultural nationalization and cultural internationalization. Now, I believe there is a middle ground, and I believe that middle ground can be supported by a normative argument, also in terms of the law. Now, we are typically used to property being an alienable type of idea, an idea that can be transferred primarily because it is substitutable. Now, I believe that there could be certain types of cultural property, particularly, that belong to a group that are so inherent to the idea of the group and to the heart of what constitutes that group that may fall into an argument of inalienability. Now, the Greek claim is particularly instructive on this ground because what makes the Parthenon sculptures and the claim for their reunification so unique is that Greece is not asking for all its artifacts around the world to be returned. And as we know, classical Athens and other Greek artifacts are all over the world. There's an abundance of them throughout museums around the globe. However, the Greek claim only relates to the Parthenon sculptures, and there is something particularly unique with this claim, being the fact that the Greeks feel that they have been robbed of something so inherent and core to their national identity and national pride that perhaps may not have been or should not have been alienated. And that type of property particularly may be better suited through a different type of legal regime that would warrant inalienability. Now, this would be a normative argument with perhaps some legal grounds for Greece, but overall I do think that the middle ground can be reached by what your reporter very well pointed out, avoiding questions of ownership, at least in the beginning. Now, questions of ownership are important, but when you have a dispute, and a legal dispute potentially, that with two parties that are so alienated at this point in a negotiation, you may want to approach it through incremental grounds. There are means to establish a common ground between the British Museum and the Greek government, and by extension the Acropolis Museum, that could satisfy both parties without having to run into questions of ownership. There could be touring collections, exchange of artifacts. Greece has a lot of cultural property items in their storage rooms that could go back to the British Museum and cater a room of equal prestige with the current one that the Parthenon sculptures are being hosted in. So there are possibilities of both parties gaining something from the return of the Parthenon sculptures instead of looking at this as a loss, as a necessary loss for one of the parties.
Amr al-Hazem, what do you say to this argument then that these treasures are part of the world's shared heritage and that they should transcend political boundaries, and in that sense it shouldn't matter where they're kept?
No, I agree with the first part of what you're saying, obviously, and I agree with what your previous guest just said, that really much of our cultural heritage, especially in places like Syria, is really part of our world heritage. Syria has 6 World Heritage Sites, and they're designated World Heritage Sites because they do contribute to our world heritage. But that does not necessarily mean that it does not matter wherever they are, they can be integrated or curated, and that's fine. I still think it is very important if in the instance of where you would ideally want to have them, and that is where there's a connection with the local community, where the culture originates from. But I think we should differentiate between ownership and curatorship. The ownership of this cultural heritage, particularly with items that are really of strong symbolic meaning to the people whose culture it represents or where it comes from. I think the issue of ownership should always finally return to these people. Now, where this item is curated, there are many, many ways in our modern contemporary, technology and ways for museums to interact. There are many, many different ways that we can do this, where we can address both the needs of ownership and the sensitivities of ownership, and also the need to bring these items to the widest possible audience. And we can't deny the fact that if a particular piece that is very representative of my culture gets the opportunity to be showcased, to be displayed in a museum like the Met Museum here in New York, like the British Museum in London, like the Louvre in Paris, it is getting the widest possible exposure, and that is a good thing. That is not a bad thing. So, but you have to approach this issue with that kind of sensitivity. And, I don't know if this is something that is necessarily appropriate for the Elgin marbles per se, the pieces from Pop, but there are many pieces where you can say, okay, you own this piece, but would it be possible for us to have this on a long-term loan, for example? This is one very simple way of addressing this issue, where the country can still claim ownership, and it has offered it up on a long-term loan, or because it feels that then it is being represented as a country, as a culture, to the wider world.
All right, I want to get Peter's take on some of that, just in the couple of minutes we got left as well.
Well, it's interesting that in the case of the Parthenon sculptures, there's been a shift in recent years in many of the Greek arguments away from a very stark nationalistic argument towards something that's a bit more sophisticated, trying to persuade the British Museum to agree to a loan, or to the Parthenon sculptures being, in a sort of enclave of the British Museum in Athens or something like that. Now, I think those are very problematic solutions, but it's interesting that there's been that shift away from the nationalistic perspective, and I think that's a good thing. I'm very nervous about this idea that we should assume that there's a sort of essential bond between particular artefacts and a particular culture.
All right, on that we are going to have to leave it. Thank you very much to all three of our guests, Peter Stewart, Nadia Banteka and Amr al-Hazem. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.